take up the vaccine is a lot of distrust in government, unfortunately. And that distrust doesn't come from the question of health per se, but comes from a whole range of experiences in terms of government policy. People just don't have that trust. And it's, yeah, that's a significant consequence, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, it's not, I think at the moment, it's not so much government here as I must say the medical profession on the whole, I think has been excellent. And I've stopped listening to the politicians, but whenever the key medical people come on TV, I listen to what they say.
Yeah.
They've usually got sensible advice. And of course, particularly people, older age groups, the advice now is just get vaccinated and stay at home as much as possible, particularly now the cold months are coming.
Indeed.
And I'm sure that's true in Netherlands, Germany, and France as well.
Yeah.
But as I say, I had some emails from friends in the Netherlands over the last few days, and they say things are really, at the moment, quite chaotic. Government's very unpopular. Because it seemed to be flipping and flopping and not quite sure what to do on an even day-to-day basis.
Indeed.
So, yeah, we're not out of the woods yet.
No.
We're going to be living with this virus now, I think, for at least another 6 months.
Indeed.
So just have to put up with it.
And especially, I heard in Western Australia, the state's government is still very strict.
Oh, extremely strict.
Foreigners to come.
Well, they did. I mean,
Australia, not just foreigners, Australian citizens.
Australian citizens, other states as well, yeah?
Oh, absolutely. So at the moment, it's almost impossible to get into Western Australia from anywhere.
Well, and you know, there are supposed to be thousands, probably over 10,000 Australians here in Britain who can't get home.
I mean, I was one of the Australians in Indonesia that couldn't get back for a long time, but because I had a medical status, when they organized one repatriation flight in August, I was able to get on it with my family. So, but there were a lot of people that still couldn't get back who were already identified as vulnerable. It's how it is. And if I'd been repatriated via Sydney, I would never have been able to get back to Western Australia. So I was just lucky that our flight went to the Northern Territory, which also had a zero COVID status. And that was just luck. That was really just luck.
Interesting.
So, crazy.
So Professor, do you know the late Ibu Konta Intan Damanik?
Yes, in fact, I spent some time actually at Satya-Wacana. Oh, it must have been 1985, 86, somewhere around about then. Because we did a survey of Central Java that turned out to be quite interesting, but she helped me with that. And then we were in touch on and off, but sadly, of course, then she developed cancer and passed away.
Yeah.
But no, she was quite a live wire, I think.
Yeah, because she was my lecturer on economic development. Formerly head of Center for Small and Micro Enterprise Dynamic. Therefore, maybe the research mostly is on the micro and small enterprises. That's also relate to her concern, her area of expertise. However, it's said that she passed away when we commemorate the 50th anniversary of our faculty.
Oh, that was sad.
So this afternoon, this afternoon,
Go on,
you're going to talk about institution reform in agriculture. Am I right?
That's right. Yeah.
All right. So I'm not from economic development background because my background is from finance management, but I did my PhD in Curtin, so stayed for a while in Perth.
Yes.
doing the economics and finance, but because of helping Ibu Rebecca, I hope I can perform the moderator duty this afternoon well enough. Yeah, but I'm sure you will deliver a very interesting topic on institution for export agriculture. Yeah.
Well, I have some slides, and I'll really just talk to the slides. But there is a paper that I sent to Para Henry. But if anybody would like the paper, they can just email me and I will send it. It's actually a paper I prepared for a conference a few years ago. And I've sort of been thinking about doing something more with it. But of course, the whole agricultural situation in Indonesia is changing quite rapidly.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, although the role of agriculture in the economy, if you look just GDP, it's declining, it's still an important source of employment. But I think more important, of course, many households now in Indonesia, they may be called agricultural households, but they're making, of course, they have very diversified sources of income. And in fact, now, on average, certainly in Java, what the Bureau of Statistics or Statistics Indonesia call agricultural households and enumerate in the agricultural census as agricultural households. In fact, they're earning quite a lot of their incomes from other sources. So I sometimes think we should scrap the term agricultural household and just talk about, well, perhaps diversified rural enterprises, because that's really what they are. Small family-based enterprises, usually, not always, but usually. But, you know, the key thing is that people can be active in different sectors at different times of the year. Different household members can be active in different sectors. So you're looking at a much more diversified picture, even compared to...
Interesting that you say that, Professor Booth. Just
Sorry,
was that just the no, that was okay. No, I was my my doctoral work was with rural communities in Java. Since the period that I examined was from 1998 until 2018, and the question that you're raising about the nature of household incomes and livelihoods and those kinds of things. All of that is true. What I found, though, certainly in my case studies, was that the diversification in terms of how people sought family incomes still remained within the context of what we would call rural economies. So they were still in areas that were predominantly rural, not yet urbanized, and in actual fact provided part of the infrastructures for local political economies to run. But yes, I definitely think there's a lot of work to be done at looking at these smallholder farmer households. And then, of course, the other issue is how these big national infrastructure drives are putting pressure on areas that have remained rural up until now, but are actually disrupting all kinds of aspects of local and regional economies through the constructions of roads, dams, mines, all of these kinds of things. And then, of course, if we compare what happens in Java or in other parts of Indonesia in terms of rural economies, of course, there's a lot of disparities as well. But yeah, I think there's a lot of space to do a lot more work on addressing these questions. The thing that I saw was really important is the struggles by a lot of families to retain their foothold on land, to not lose that foothold. And in the latest COVID crisis, where there's been a loss of employment in a structural sense, particularly in terms of urban economies, rural areas have been able to absorb sections of the population again, like we saw in the 97-98 financial crisis. And so that question, like, we don't have these rigid markers between urban and rural societies and economies. There's still a lot of interactions, but that's both in terms of people's employment, but also in terms of social welfare. And rural societies still play a big part in guaranteeing people's survival in the context of crisis. So yeah, anyway, just a few comments.
It's like a
those.
social capital.
Yeah.
I think in terms of institution, I ever attend a seminar by Central Bank of Indonesia. The former governor of Central Bank, the one that graduated from the Netherlands, have a plan of exploiting actually the economics of scale. So like our discussion, usually it's a subsistent agriculture household, so they cannot expand their business to the limit of the scale. So what he's trying to do, the Bank Indonesia is pioneering a program like making the enterprise on combining several household agriculture just to have larger area of farming so that they can have an economical experience, the economics of scale on that enterprise. And the government program of village-owned enterprises, I think, might serve a good mechanism to also expand the agricultural productivity. I don't know. Maybe that will be the focus of our today's seminar.
Well, I think one has to be very careful about talking about economies of scale in agriculture. I mean, there's a lot of evidence, certainly from Indonesia, but many other parts of Asia as well, that in fact, productivity per hectare is often higher, sometimes quite a lot higher, on the smaller farms.
Exactly.
And by small, one can even be talking about, just a pekarangan, a house garden attached to a house that may be, 0.1 of a hectare.
Exactly.
I often think, in Europe, of course, because many people live in apartments and don't have their own gardens, there's a lot of people like to get allotments. Even in London, there is, I'm told, quite a big waiting list to get an allotment. And then people will use, they're often quite small, perhaps half an acre or even less, but people cultivate them very intensively for fruit, for vegetables, for flowers, and so on. And particularly older people. This is very popular. And I sometimes think one has to see this. And of course, Java now is an aging population. And I think typically, of course, many people will go back to their villages as they get older, if they've been working in urban areas. They'll have made a bit of money, have some savings, and they tend to take them back and then develop a small business that may be partly based on agriculture and partly based on other activities. And I think we're going to see more of this, actually, in the context, certainly, of Java and Bali, possibly other parts of Indonesia as well. So I think, villages will increasingly be older folk, and they're relatively young. And one sees this very clearly there was a lot of discussion about it in China now, but also countries like Thailand. You're getting grandparents looking after grandchildren, while the people in the prime working age are off in the towns and cities, trying to make a living in non-agricultural occupations. The Chinese, I think, are very worried about this because they think it often disadvantages the children to be left with grandparents. I know a student of mine did a dissertation in Thailand on this as well. Particularly, he was looking at the north and northeast, where you've always had out-migration, particularly to the Bangkok region. And the Thais have this term skip generation household, which is basically grandparents or older relations looking after often very young children. And that seems to be quite, whether it's a good thing or not, well, there's a lot of discussion. I mean, many parents feel they simply can't take their children to the cities with them. They can't. And of course, China, it's all made much more complicated by the hukou system, which really makes it very difficult for migrants to get access to education and healthcare for their children. They can get a job themselves. But if they want to bring young children, it becomes extremely difficult. Now, of course, many economists want to see the end of the hukou caste system in China, but so far it hasn't happened. So you've got the skip generation household phenomenon, and it seems to be very widespread. I haven't seen as much work on it in Indonesia, but my guess is it's there, it's happening.
There is some work that's been done on it. And if you like, I can send you some references later. Yeah, definitely. There's some in my work as well, but there's also some of the rural institutes who've done some work on this. And while there are trends, and particularly if you look at upper data from the national PPS, the Center for, what is the English? The
Statistical Bureau.
Yeah, the Statistics Bureau, the National Statistics Bureau. Quantitative data tends to suggest that, but some of the qualitative research that's actually delved into these phenomena tells a bit of a different story. And part of that is that young people go away and work for a certain period of time to collect money and come back and purchase land. One of the reasons is because their parents have smaller and smaller plots of land as families divide up their land. So young people don't have their own land. So they go away, they work, they come back, they buy land, and actually taking up agricultural work. And the other increasingly pressure in terms of people who move to the cities to not bring families is the rising cost of living in urban centres, which particularly in the last 5 to 10 years is quite extraordinary. I've been there for the last 20 years, and the last 5 years is like bit mind-blowing in terms of rises in cost of living. So for anybody trying to make
that housing or
housing is a huge part. The cost of housing is, even rental housing, which used to be notoriously very cheap, is now much more significant. Purchasing land is even more ridiculous. It's beyond the means of ordinary people, certainly. But other costs in terms of utilities, cost of food, even in terms of basic things like, oil, sugar, flour, all of the most basic things that we always thought were really low. The rising costs in terms of share of monthly family incomes is quite significant, I think.
Okay.
So, is it time to start? Or?
Yeah, I think it's time to start now. Isn't it, Ibu Rebecca?
I think so, Professor Afriani, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so Professor Booth, will it be enough for you to present it in 30 minutes and then we continue with the question and answer session?
Hello.
That sounds fine.
Sounds fine. Okay, so shall we now start? Is it okay?
That's fine, yeah.
All right. So, sorry, Ibu Rebecca, yes?
No, please go ahead, Professor Afriani.
Do you want me to click share screen or?
No.
I will do that.
Ibu Rebecca will assist you with that. Okay, then I'll start the webinar now. Okay. Good morning, all the participants of today's webinar. Welcome to the webinar series commemorating the 65th anniversary of Satya Christian University. Today, we will discuss the role of institutions in the development process. It is a privilege for us to have Professor Emerita Anne Booth from School of Oriental and Asian Studies, University of London, as our distinguished speaker this afternoon. Before we continue to the session, please allow me to introduce our speaker. Professor Anne Booth is working currently in School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Professor Booth has taught at School of Oriental and African Studies since 1991. Her teaching and research focuses on economic development in Asia, with special emphasis on Southeast Asia. Professor Booth's research
Sí, sí,
areas.
sí, vamos, entonces va a ir para organizar, pero
Uh,
la representación en va. Nega.
Okay, I'm sorry, we still have a speaker. Okay, now I will continue to introduce Prof. Ann Booth. So, Professor Ann Booth is Professor Emerita in School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Her research areas make comparative studies of trends in living standard in Southeast Asia in the 20th century, as well as the dynamics of decentralization and development in Southeast Asia, with special reference to Indonesia. So Professor Booth already writes several books, and the recent books are Economic Change in Modern Indonesia, Colonial and Post-Colonial Comparisons, Living Standards in Southeast Asia, Changes over the Long 20th Century 19 to 2015, published by Amsterdam University Press, and then Fiscal Capacity and Colonial State in Asia and Africa by Cambridge University Press. Today's webinar will examine the role of institutions in the development process with special reference to export-oriented agriculture in Southeast Asia. As we know that since 19th century, farmers across Southeast Asia have grown a range of crops for both national and international markets. The traditional land tenure system performed well in facilitating this growth, but recently there have been pressures to reform this institution, often from bilateral and multilateral development agency. How the post-independence efforts to develop new institutions, and how is the role of technocrats in implementing institutional change, both in Indonesia and other parts of Asia, is the central theme of our present webinar. To know the answer and have more understanding on the central theme of today's webinar, allow me to ask Professor Booth to commence the presentation, and then after the 30 minutes of the presentation, we will have the time for question and answer. You may type in your question in the chat box or raise hand and your mic will be unmuted after the presentation. Professor Booth, time is yours now.
Thank you. Yes, so in this presentation is called Institutions and Governance, particularly looking at the case of export-oriented agriculture in Southeast Asia. And I have some slides. I'll really just talk to the slides. There is also a paper. I sent a copy to Pak Henry, and he can share it with you if you're interested in. So can we have, sorry, what do I do to get the next slide? Can you, yes, here we are.
Professor Booth, sorry, if you want me to move to the next slide, just say next slide and I will do it.
Okay, fine, yeah. Let me do that, right. Well, sorry, can we go back to the first slide? Yes, the key, next slide, yes, sorry, he was flipping around. Here we are, that's fine. Well, the key question really is, why have some colonies performed better than others? And this, I think, is really one of the most difficult questions to have arisen, certainly from studies of comparative economic growth in the latter part of the 20th century. Now, as we know, in the Asian context, most countries emerged into independence in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. The 15 years or so from 1945 through to 1960. Africa was on average roughly about a decade later. Now, of course, it's pretty well known most parts of Asia have done rather better than most parts of Africa since independence, at least if we use GDP growth as the main metric. But even within Asia, there's been quite a lot of difference. Some countries obviously have performed much better than others. There's a big literature on the performance, particularly of Taiwan and South Korea. They were both Japanese colonies, and some scholars have tended to attribute their superior performance to the Japanese colonial legacy. I'm myself a bit skeptical about that. but my own feeling is that the evidence isn't quite as strong as some of these writers have argued. More broadly, in the last 20 years or so, we've had some very influential work pioneered by a group of scholars working in the United States, Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson. They've tended to attribute the relative backwardness of many former tropical colonies to weak institution building in the colonial era. And that itself, at least according to these authors, was the result of relatively small European populations in most tropical colonies, compared obviously with, say, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, even some parts of Latin America. But this, of course, doesn't really explain, or to me at least, it doesn't satisfactorily explain the different outcomes across former colonies. Now, it's frequently said that institutions matter, but why? And what sort of institutions matter? Can some institutions actually be dysfunctional? Can we have the next slide? Sorry, can we go on to the next slide? Yes. Defining institutions. Well, the term institution has been very widely used, but often in different ways. Douglas North, a well-known American economic historian who wrote a lot on issues relating to institutions, really beginning in the 1980s, he called them humanly devised constraints that structure political, economic, and social interaction. And he went on to point out in several writings that these constraints can be both informal, including, of course, customary taboos, codes of conduct, and formal rules through codified laws, constitutions even. Another writer, Edmund Graefe, who's written quite a lot in recent decades, he also has emphasized the importance of, quote, rules, beliefs, and norms, as well as their manifestations as organizations. Graefe and indeed others have defined as an institution a system of rules, beliefs, and norms, and organization that together tend to generate regularities of social behavior. Yet another recent book by Allen, was published about a decade ago, he argued that an institution is a complicated collection of expectations, norms, and constraints. And they work together to influence the way people interact with each other, not just, of course, in their economic life, but in other aspects of their lives as well. Okay, next slide. All these definitions you'll see are really pretty broad. They obviously place stress on behavioral norms as well as codified laws. But such norms are not always easy for social scientists to quantify or indeed to analyze. And as people like Graefe have pointed out, the complex nature of institutions does tend to imply that a superficial study can be really quite misleading. Another important strand in the recent literature relates to policies which governments, and these are governments that are often advised by bilateral or multilateral development agencies, policies that they can implement to change institutions in line with international best practice. Now, this can be a bit tricky, and indeed, this kind of, if you like, top-down attempt to transfer institutions across countries, or even indeed across regions within a country. These have often tended to fail. William Easterly, another American economist, who's written quite a lot on these issues, he thinks that top-down attempts to transfer institutions can in fact be difficult and indeed prone to failure. often quite counterproductive in producing consequences that weren't anticipated. Okay, can we move on to the next slide? Now, a lot of this literature has tended to place great emphasis on the creation of particular institutions such as property rights. Some authors, in fact, have been rather critical of this emphasis on property rights. Peter Evans, well-known American social scientist, who's worked in this area a lot, he thinks this emphasis is misplaced, and indeed the whole, if you like, burden of property rights can be quite dangerous. He says it's been forced to carry far too heavy an explanatory burden. People like North and others, of course, have tended to argue that countries won't make progress in terms of economic growth unless they have fairly clearly laid out systems of individual property rights. On the other hand, some economic historians, Deirdre McCloskey, well-known American economic historian, who's written on the evolution of property rights in Europe, she's been very critical, particularly of the work of Acemoglu and some of his colleagues, on the grounds of simple historical inaccuracy. She argues they've just got their facts wrong, especially regarding their discussion of the absence or the alleged absence of secure property rights in early modern Europe. In the context of both Asia and indeed Africa, several scholars have argued that the conventional dichotomy between so-called backward or dysfunctional communal tenure and modern individual tenure, particularly in rural areas, this can be very misleading. These arguments have been made, for example, by Tony Hopkins, British economic historian, who's done a lot of work, particularly on West Africa. Okay, can we go on to the next slide? Yeah, let's look for a moment at the Southeast Asian story, and particularly the story of export-oriented agriculture. Now, of course, anybody who knows anything about Southeast Asian history knows that there's been a long history of exporting agricultural products. Spices, of course, including pepper, nutmeg, and others, tropical hardwoods, particularly teak, and then more recently, crops such as sugar, tobacco, coffee, and tea. In the late 19th, early 20th century, we saw the growth of what's sometimes been called the three delta phenomenon. This was the very rapid growth of rice production for export in Burma, in Thailand, particularly central Thailand, and southern Vietnam. Now, rice, of course, has always been grown as a food crop throughout Asia. But what happened in particularly the latter part of the 19th, early 20th century, is that small farmers, particularly in these three regions, began to grow more and more rice for regional and indeed global markets. Another related activity was, of course, the introduction of new crops. This began on large estates, particularly the case with crops such as tobacco, rubber, vegetable oils, particularly palm oil. But increasingly, these crops were also taken up by smallholders. The rubber phenomenon, for example, has been particularly noticeable in Indonesia and Thailand in recent decades. Broadly speaking, we can say that smallholder producers in Indonesia, and indeed many other parts of Southeast Asia, responded robustly to opportunities presented by global markets, as I said, for a whole range of crops, including rice, coffee, spices, coconut, rubber, and of course, vegetable oils. Okay. Can we go on to the next slide? Well, what institutions help smallholders? Typically, as far as we can make out, and I think this is an area where we still need to do a lot more research, but it seems that smallholders relied on what we might term traditional tenure systems, both to expand production of crops like rice, but also to expand production of perennial crops, including, of course, rubber. Now, if we assume that these smallholders were rational, and I think they were by and large, clearly they're not going to invest time and money in planting crops, and particularly crops like rubber, and indeed other tree crops, coffee, for example, which took, in the case of rubber, 7 years to mature. They wouldn't have done so if they hadn't had confidence that they had some legal title to this land, and indeed the trees on the land. And indeed, legal title, not just for themselves, but for their children and indeed broader extended families. Now, often, in fact, I think in the majority of cases, this title was in fact conferred by traditional tenure systems. Colonial governments did, in some cases, try to impose individual titles. The success was variable, particularly in the case of Indonesia, and I think to some extent other parts of Southeast Asia as well. Land taxes were imposed by colonial governments. And indeed, people were given basically a land tax demand on a particular plot of land, which was also seen as proof of ownership. I think this was the case in Java by the early 20th century, not so much outside Java or Java and Bali, but certainly by the early 20th century, there was quite an active land market in Java. Land was bought and sold, and the proof of ownership tended to be the land tax certificate. Okay, can we go on to the next slide? Now, of course, it wasn't enough just to have access to land. If you were growing a crop essentially for a national or international market, you had to have a marketing network. That was crucial for smallholders. What tended to happen in many parts of Southeast Asia is these marketing networks were often developed not by indigenous cultivators themselves, but by Chinese settlers. They often had better links, particularly with the larger traders in the port cities. Sometimes the relationship between the indigenous smallholders who grew the crops and the Chinese, and to a lesser extent, other migrant minorities, the Indians, particularly in parts of British Malaya. There was friction, but at the same time, I think relationships were built up on trust. And indeed, the Chinese did often extend credit to indigenous smallholders, credit that certainly wasn't easily available from formal financial institutions. In addition, you had the development of large entrepôts, particularly Singapore, of course, was particularly important in the rubber sector. But of course, port cities such as Bangkok and Rangoon became Saigon in southern Vietnam. They all became important for the export of rice. It's interesting that quite a lot of the actual development of cultivation took place in regions where often the colonial presence was rather small. Of course, Thailand was never a colony. And regions where there were few large estates. In fact, Carl Peltzer, an American geographer who wrote extensively on these issues, particularly in the context of Indonesia, he felt that there were good reasons why smallholder production tended to develop well away from the large estates, who simply didn't want the competition. And this was an issue that did lead to some friction, particularly during the 1930s, when, of course, the World Depression hit Southeast Asia, mainly in the form of falling prices for many export crops. Can we go on to the next slide? So one had, I think, a picture of a number of different ethnic groups, people coming from a variety of religions, which of course reflected the diversity of the Southeast Asian region as a whole, but growing crops, which often had not been familiar. Certainly it was the case of rubber, which of course was originally from the Amazon region of South America, of Brazil. But when they got the opportunity, they took up cultivation of rubber. As I say, marketed through these networks, which were developed often by the migrant minorities in the region, particularly the Chinese. I think any generalization about Muslims or Buddhists not being responsive to market incentives does need to be treated with caution. The evidence simply doesn't support these sorts of generalizations. They were sometimes, not always, but sometimes made by colonial officials who I think were hostile to smallholder involvement in export production. Again, this varied across the region. I think it was probably most pronounced in British Malaya, where the British really were quite determined not to allow indigenous Malays to grow crops such as rubber. They thought that, of course, prices were subject to considerable fluctuations on world markets. They worried that in good times, when prices were high, farmers might be tempted to take on too much debt. To a lesser extent, I think these doubts were shared by Dutch officials, but on the whole, they tended to be less interventionist, partly, I think, because the Dutch presence in many parts of Sumatra, Kalimantan, and eastern Indonesia, where these crops were grown, the Dutch presence was really quite small. Even if they'd wanted to stop farmers growing rubber, they couldn't have done so. They simply didn't have the administrative capacity. There was one country or one region where I think the British fears about farmers becoming indebted had some merit, and that was Burma, where the Chettiar caste, that was a caste of money lenders from South India, they migrated across to Burma and did lend a lot of money to indigenous Burmese cultivators growing rice. This caused all sorts of problems in the 1930s when there was widespread alienation of land. Farmers that were in debt found they couldn't pay when rice prices started to collapse, had to surrender their land to the moneylenders, the Chettiars. As I said, the British and Malaya were very worried about this and really stopped Chettiars lending, certainly on a large-scale basis, to cultivators in British Malaya, what were called the federated and unfederated states. But that meant they hadn't really become involved in growing cash crops in the way that their equivalents in Sumatra, for example, were able to do. Okay, the next slide. Well, after independence, I said post-1950, most of the major countries in Southeast Asia became independent. Smallholder crop cultivation continued to grow, but perhaps surprisingly, the policies adopted by several of the newly independent governments were not always very supportive of smallholder producers of export crops. The well-known Burmese economist Clow Mint wrote a paper in the 1960s that made a distinction between what he termed the inward and the outward-looking countries of Southeast Asia. At that time, he put his own country, Burma, and Indonesia into the inward-looking category. He pointed out that the post-independence governments tended to be more hostile to migrant groups than the colonial governments had been. That really meant the Chinese in Indonesia and the Indians in Burma. But in addition, and partly as a result of this hostility, the governments tended to disrupt the old marketing networks that had grown up, not just for rubber, but for a range of other crops as well. They also, and perhaps this was one of the most serious problems, they tended to overvalue exchange rates, have exchange rates which were really quite unrealistic. And these functioned as a substantial tax on exporters, but inevitably this encouraged smuggling. In addition, as Mint pointed out, both Indonesia and Burma tended to discourage foreign investment in both agriculture and manufacturing. In fact, Indonesia, of course, in the late 1950s, nationalized the large estates which had been owned by the Dutch. But more broadly, I think one can say over this period, Western development institutions generally were treated with suspicion. This wasn't the case to anything like the same extent in what Mint called the outward-looking countries, which at that time included British Malaya, or Malaysia as it became, and Thailand, and indeed the Philippines. Okay, next slide, please. The whole issue of macroeconomic stability became more and more important across Southeast Asia in the 1950s and 1960s. And these outward-looking countries, particularly Thailand and Malaysia, developed institutions which supported macroeconomic stability. Thailand became quite famous for having a stable exchange rate, really from the early 1950s right through to the early 1980s. The baht was pretty stable at about 20 to the US dollar. And that was true of the Malaysian currency, which became the ringgit after Malaysia moved to independence. Now, this stability was brought about by strong institutions, particularly central banks and finance ministries. Technocrats in these institutions were given a fair amount of independence to direct fiscal and monetary policies. This was certainly not the case in Indonesia until the change of government in 1966. Famously, of course, when Suharto became acting president, he relied on a group of economists from the University of Indonesia, the so-called Berkeley Mafia, he gave them a fair degree of autonomy in directing fiscal and monetary policies. And that led ultimately to a stabilization of the exchange rate, and inflation was brought down from the very high levels prevailing in the mid-1960s. In Thailand, quite a lot's been written about what's sometimes called the four-agency system. This was a group of key agencies: Ministry of Finance, the Planning Board, the Bank of Thailand, as the central bank was called, and indeed the Bureau of the Budget in the Prime Minister's office. These agencies were extremely influential in conducting economic policy and were given a fair degree of autonomy, even though Thailand was notoriously unstable politically with coups and counter coups and so on for much of the period from the 1950s right down to the 1980s. In fact, the economy did reasonably well. Thailand continued to produce large exportable surpluses of rice, whereas Vietnam and Burma, because of essentially the policies pursued by governments, didn't encourage smallholder production of rice or indeed other crops to anything like the same extent. It's true that farmers in Thailand were taxed and that the income gap between urban Bangkok and the rest of the country was considerable. And Thailand indeed became somewhat notorious over the 1970s for what was termed urban bias. And it's true that the production of infrastructure, education, health services, and so on, was far better in the urban areas, and particularly the greater Bangkok area, than in other parts of the country. But it was only in the early years of the 21st century that one politician, Thaksin, exploited these regional grievances. Not surprisingly, he won strong support from the north of the country, but managed to alienate groups at the center. Okay, next slide. As I touched earlier on this whole issue of top-down versus bottom-up institutional development, successful implementation of institutional development often was the result of demands. And again, Thailand, I think, was interesting because the farmers became somewhat more organized over the 1970s and 1980s. They actually began to demand more secure land titles. And Thailand had a big land titling program, particularly in the north of the country, funded by the World Bank, and I think there's some Australian money as well. This was often considered a great success. And I think it was a success, partly because it really did respond to the needs of farmers. They wanted the title mainly to get credit and also access to government-provided support services. And here I think one can draw the lesson that the implementation of policies like, for example, land titling, the implementation tends to be more successful when the political system has some legitimacy in the eyes of rural people. If we look at the Philippines, again, rather interesting in terms of the policy, particularly of the Americans in the period up to 1942, when they were when they governed the Philippines. They also encouraged the formation of family farms, which were owner cultivated. But this policy was frustrated partly by rapid growth of population. And this led, of course, to holdings being subdivided into farms that couldn't support families of 6 or more, and led to a rapid growth, particularly in parts of the northern island of Luzon, rapid growth of landlessness. The policy of the Americans was, I think, to try and encourage non-agricultural employment, but this didn't grow rapidly enough to provide productive employment. And after 1960, of course, many Filipinos started to look abroad for employment. And this process has in fact spread to other parts of the region as well, particularly Indonesia. We have the next slide. Well, very briefly, I think my time probably is up. So just on conclusions, well, first of all, I think many parts of Southeast Asia, smallholder producers have responded robustly to the opportunities presented by growing international demand for a whole range of products. There was certainly no coercion involved. In fact, the coercion tended to be, when it was applied by governments in the 1930s, it was intended to stop or at least curb smallholder production, partly at least to protect larger states. This didn't happen in Thailand because there were very few larger states, but it did happen to some extent in other parts of the region. My own view is that there isn't really strong evidence that attempts by colonial governments to impose new tenure systems from above, that these were important in encouraging smallholder export cultivation. I think many smallholders were able to rely on traditional tenure systems, and they worked reasonably well. As I said, marketing networks were obviously crucial. They tended to be provided by migrant minorities, Chinese and Indians in particular. The next slide. Smallholder cultivators of export crops belong to a variety of ethnic and religious groups. And I think this is very important to stress. I think generalizations about, quote, Muslims or, quote, Buddhists not being responsible to market incentives simply didn't, they just were not correct. I think they were put about sometimes by colonial, sometimes by post-colonial officials who have for other reasons been rather hostile to the development of smallholder crop cultivation for export. As I said, in the post-independence period, you might have thought governments would be much more supportive of smallholder exporters. That hasn't always been the case. As I said, I think Indonesia in the immediate post-independence era tended to adopt quite aggressively anti-Chinese policies. I think even more detrimental was mounting inflation and overvalued exchange rate, and this led to widespread smuggling. So I think macroeconomic instability and the institutions which brought about macroeconomic stability, this was very important, perhaps more important than some historians have tended to concede. Last slide. Yeah. When one talks about macroeconomic stability, of course, one does immediately have to address this issue of the role of technocrats. Perhaps surprisingly, not that much has actually been written about why technocrats have been more important, more successful in some countries than in others, and in particular countries, why they've been more important in some periods than in others. Sometimes argued that across much of Southeast Asia, their influence has tended to decline, whether one looks at Thailand, indeed Malaysia, Indonesia, their influence has declined in recent years. And to the extent that's true, I think we need to think more carefully about what the explanations are, and particularly has the growth of democracy in a country like Indonesia, for example, in the post-Suharto era, has this somehow had an adverse effect on the influence of technocrats, particularly in these key institutions, ministries of finance, central banks, planning commissions, etc. Certainly when we look at Southeast Asia today, we see really remarkable differences in per capita GDP. I like to point out the difference between Malaysia and Myanmar. Probably in the late colonial period, the parts of British Malaya that became Malaysia in the 1960s, they had a per capita GDP that was certainly higher than Myanmar, but no more than 2 or at most 3 times higher. In 2020, the most recent figures from the World Bank suggest Malaysia's per capita GDP was at least 6 times higher than Myanmar, perhaps even more. Why have you had this remarkable change? Why has one country grown so much faster than another from a broadly similar base in the colonial period? This is the sort of question that, in my view, the work of Acemoglu and others can't really explain satisfactorily. Perhaps lastly, I could just draw attention again to this whole issue of whether or to what extent institutions can be imposed from above, particularly by international organizations like the World Bank. My own view is this is a high-risk strategy, and it can easily produce unintended consequences, which often, of course, run counter to the original intentions of the policy. But at the same time, those that advocate a more bottom-up process of institutional reform, they have to concede that there are problems. These bottom-up processes can take time, and for various reasons, they often don't proceed smoothly. And indeed, I think they may themselves need further reform in the future. I mean, the whole issue of institutional change, institutional reform, it's an ongoing process. And governments can never, I think, take for granted that the institutions necessary to support economic development, that they will just evolve without direct government intervention. Okay, well, let me leave it there and perhaps get some comments or questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Booth, for the enlightening presentation. Now, I'll give the chance for the question and answer session for 5 participants who would like to raise their question. Since I did not see any comments on the chat column, then I allow the participant who would like to ask just to turn on the microphone, state your name, and directly ask the question to Professor Booth. 5 participants who would like to use this opportunity, you are allowed to do so now. It's an interesting topic from a historical point of view, how traditional tenure of land changed. Okay, Mr. Charanbal, please ask your question.
Thank you very much, Ibu Apriyani. Thank you so much, Professor Booth, for a very engaging and interesting talk. I guess the question, my question would be from the perspective that you adopt, and your historical method here, which I tend to guess, I tend to understand it as a kind of a historical materialism. How would you then understand the period in Southeast Asia from the 1990s onwards? So clearly, institutions are changing. A lot of the important things that you've mentioned earlier are happening and sort of changing at the same time. Institutions become a bit less residual. We've seen a shift away from a developmental state to a more regulatory state. The nature of institutions change. Resource sectors in Southeast Asia become even more plugged into global markets, but at the same time you sort of see more imposition from the top, especially when we talk about structural adjustment policies from the 1990s onwards, which again, differences within countries as well. So I guess the general question is, how do you see these developments from your perspective from the 1990s onwards? Thank you.
Okay. Professor Booth, would you like to directly answer, or we collect first the 5 questions?
Perhaps it might be better to directly answer. I mean, just on this, yes. As I say, processes of institutional reform are ongoing. They never stop. In my view, it's highly undesirable for governments to try and stop institutional change. On the other hand, they have to try and facilitate changes. For example, the growth of new export crops. One of the most interesting developments, certainly in Malaysia, and indeed controversial developments, has been the growth of palm oil over the last 30 years, to the point now where the larger state sector in Indonesia is not entirely, but almost entirely now a palm oil sector. Rubber is now very largely grown by smallholders. There's still a few rubber estates around, but not very many. And they're likely to be converted, I think, to other uses in future years. Now, on the whole, wisely, I think the Indonesian government hasn't tried to stop this, but I think they've permitted probably foreign companies, particularly from Malaysia and Singapore, to control the development of the palm oil sector in ways that often haven't been, certainly from an environmental point of view, haven't been satisfactory. I think it's true that while palm oil is not the only reason for continuing deforestation, it's one reason. But on top of that, I think the tendency of government has been in recent years rather to favor large estates over smallholders. Now, this is an ongoing issue, and my own view is a serious one. And I think the Indonesian government has to address it more directly than has been the case, at least up until quite recently. Elsewhere in the region, I think all sorts of interesting things have been happening in Vietnam. As I said, Vietnam, partly because it had this 30-year war of independence that really wasn't finalized until 1975. And Vietnam only began to open up to the global economy in the late 80s, early 90s. But this has led to a quite phenomenal growth in smallholder production for export in Vietnam, not just of rice, the traditional crop. Vietnam now, of course, has re-emerged as a major rice exporter. But on top of that, we see Vietnamese farmers growing coffee. More recently, I was reading an interesting paper about cashews in Vietnam, which have also become an important cash crop. Now, as I understand it, this is largely smallholder driven. And on the whole, I think the government has facilitated this, not least, of course, by macroeconomic policies, a much more realistic exchange rate than was the case, certainly up until the early 1990s. And on top of that, allowing marketing networks to emerge. I think Vietnam has become something of a success story in this area. Looked for a while as if Burma or Myanmar was going to open up and liberalize. It's very unclear at the moment, actually, what the policies of the military government will be, but I'm afraid I tend to be rather pessimistic about Myanmar now, having perhaps been rather too optimistic a few years ago. But again, this just reflects the fact that governments do matter. And the changes in government, wherever they, for whatever reason, changes in government can have very important implications for economic activity. And I'm not just talking about in urban areas, manufacturing and so on, but in rural areas as well.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Booth. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Another participant, you still have chance to ask Professor Booth.
Yes, can I ask the question? My name is Malcolm.
You're welcome. You can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation, Professor Booth. One issue that I didn't see from the presentation is the distinguish between Indonesia and archipelagic country. Not so when we are talking about the commodity, it really depends where the farm is and where the market. And when you are an archipelagic country, you have to cross the island. And we don't, Indonesia, as you know, we don't have the iron ore. And we don't have companies that can build ships. Why? Because Indonesia has not signed the International Convention of Arrest of Ship. So it's very difficult for the bank to finance the building of the ships. And second, electricity. Since you have this distance, the joke is, for instance, it is cheaper and then faster for you to import an orange from the Chinese than bringing the orange from Kalimantan, which is the Chinese orange is much cheaper. Why? Because of the supply chains or logistic costs. And second, in order to bring the product to the market, there is a standard that you have to fulfill. That standard depends on electricity. You have to dry it and everything. In Indonesia, even until now, we don't have the national blueprint of the need of electricity for the industry. So we don't know, how much we need electricity, and we have to develop the energy. For the household, yes, based on the 450 kilowatt per household. And the third is the system of education. System of education in Indonesia is based on class. There is no on hands, hands-on. Just recently, the law about the community college just out back in 2013. And then even that, since we didn't have the experience to do it, it's supposed to be financed by the local government. But it turns out the local government said it is the responsibility of the central government. So how can you, we need, know-how on hands-on basis to improve the quality of our product. And then we have to bring them, to cross the sea to get to the market. That in Thailand, for instance, even in the US, I lived there for 19 years. You ship your goods from Florida to Washington DC. You only use one truck and one container. That's it. That will arrive the same container, the same truck. But here in Indonesia, you have to use multimodal. From truck first, or from the river, whatever. Then you put the ship. From Eastern Indonesia. When they export their agricultural product, they have to bring it first to either Jakarta or Surabaya.
Okay, Mr. Ahmad, because of the time limitation.
Sorry.
Can you please condense your question?
Yeah, this one. The way I look the presentation is the, why, for us, of course, I'm Indonesian. What is interesting for me is why, because if we compare it to Malaysia or Thailand, we are not comparing apple to apple. Maybe that's the short answer that question for Professor Booth. Thank you so much. Sorry to take the time.
No worries. Professor Booth, maybe it's in the special characteristic of Indonesia as archipelagic countries, which cannot be compared directly to other Southeast Asian countries. Can you please answer Mr. Ahmad's question?
One more issue. The land size of Indonesia is only 24%. 76% are water.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, very brief. I mean, you raise issues, of course, that have had an immense amount of discussion in Indonesia now for 50 years or more. The whole issue of connectivity, as the World Bank likes to call it, has attracted a lot of attention. I mean, clearly everything you say is correct. Shipping costs are high. They may have come down somewhat. But of course, the famous example of oranges from Kalimantan, why the Chinese are, well, it's a very important point. And it's not just oranges. I mean, yes. There is a lot of fruit and vegetables now and other fresh products coming in from other parts of the region. And apparently they reach the market, certainly of Java, more cheaply. Now, some people accuse China of dumping fruit and vegetables. And I know there's been a lot of conflict on trade policy between Thailand and China. And I mean, where you have a land border, I think you're even more likely to get products coming in or indeed going out with very little regulatory procedures at all. It's very difficult to know quite what to do about this, and I think the government has tended to take a rather hands-off view. Perhaps that's wrong, but I think on the question of connectivity, cheaper transport costs, I mean, I know Pak Henry was very much involved with World Bank projects in this area for a number of years. And I think they've just got to keep on working away at these problems, doing whatever is possible, including building more efficient ports in eastern Indonesia. You quite rightly say the shipping industry is still, for reasons I don't fully understand, very undeveloped. I mean, it's very surprising. The country the size of Indonesia doesn't have its own shipbuilding industry. But that seems to be the case, that there hasn't been much development. And Habibie, I know, tried to get something going, but was only partial success. And then it was the whole industry was stalled by the 1997-98 crisis and so on. I think this, and again, you mentioned very important questions relating to education, particularly vocational education, the kind of education, as you say, that polytechnics supply in various parts of Europe. You mentioned community colleges in America. Indonesia just has to spend to try and develop these institutions. Now that means spending more money, and there are very serious government budgetary constraints. I think many of these problems are only going to be solved if Indonesia can raise more tax revenues. And at the moment, Indonesia's tax, the GDP ratio is very low by Asian standards. The recent OECD report claimed it was the lowest. You know, these issues where government has to take a lead, as I say, the processes of reform will be ongoing. And I can understand why Indonesians get frustrated that there hasn't been more progress over, I mean, what it was 30 years ago that during the Suharto period, Suharto, I think one of his Pidato Kenegaraan, you know, the speeches he gives on the 17th of August, I think he raised the whole issue of the underdevelopment of Eastern Indonesia compared with Western Indonesia. And there were a whole flood of seminars and conferences and discussions at that time. And there were some interesting new initiatives, but again, the financial crisis, the transition to a different form of government post-Suharto, all this seems to have made it quite difficult for Indonesia to tackle some of these problems. And as I say, I can understand why Indonesians get frustrated. But I think, again, I don't want to say that government, that everything has to be done by government. I think there's scope for more private sector involvement in education. There are a lot of private universities in Indonesia, some private schools. And perhaps there's a greater role for the private sector when it comes to vocational training and polytechnics, this sort of thing. But otherwise, we rely on government, and that means that governments will have to raise, successive governments will have to raise more revenues. I mean, the pandemic has revealed serious problems in the Indonesian health system. Now, well-informed people knew about these problems already, but it's quite clear that, you know, Indonesia doesn't have enough skilled health professionals. The ones it does have tend to be very concentrated in urban areas. And as the Department of Health is very worried about this. But in a sense, you know,
sorry, Prof. Booth, there is still one question.
Sorry, yeah.
To come. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Prof.
Okay. Mr. Joao, if you would like to ask questions, please do so.
Okay. Good afternoon. Good evening, probably, and also good morning. Professor Booth, I'm João Saldanha from Dili.
Nice to see you again. Yeah.
Nice to see you, Anne. It's glad that you are still healthy and still very talkative. I have 2 points. Number one, perhaps you can expand a little bit on the role of the technocrats in terms of development. How it was succeeded in some countries, probably in Southeast Asia, but definitely in Korea, Taiwan, but then in the others are not. That's number one. Number two, can you also point out some experiences of the overseas Chinese roles in terms of bringing in foreign direct investment? That's number two. But by the way, I have to say thank you very much for Henry to bring us. I'm coming along with several students and also another colleague that lecturer from Timor-Leste. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Joel. My apology that Pak Henry could not join us this afternoon due to sickness. But you have two questions,
Okay.
Prof. Booth. There are two questions from Pak Joel. So time is yours now.
Yeah, well, you raise this key issue of the role of technocrats. Why are they more influential in some countries than in others? And indeed, even within a country, why does their influence appear to be stronger at some times? I think these are fascinating questions. And as I say, I think more research really should be done. The questions, if you like, of political economy rather than economics. I mean, you know, economists like to think, rightly or wrongly, that, you know, they have the answers to many of these questions. And indeed they do. I mean, they know what needs to be done, for example, to stabilize, to reduce inflation, to bring about a stable exchange rate. Well, they think they know what needs to be done. But you know, why, if we have the knowledge, why is it so difficult to implement, you know, what the World Bank or the IMF likes to think of as, quote, good policy? You mentioned Taiwan and Korea, and indeed some interesting work has been done on both these countries. I know in Taiwan there was, you know, we think of Taiwan today as being very successful in terms of rapid economic growth sustained over what, a 40-year period now. Taiwan's a high income country. In fact, according to some estimates, its GDP per capita now is higher than that of Japan's, higher than many parts of Western Europe. I think there's still quite a lot about the Taiwan story we don't fully understand, but certainly it does seem to have been the case that advice from economists, whether within the country or internationally, has been important, and it's led to often quite dramatic policy changes, particularly late 1950s, early 1960s, changes in trade and exchange rate policy, fiscal and monetary policies, and so on. And don't forget agricultural policies, including land reform. Indonesia has never really been able to implement thoroughgoing land reform, either in Java or in other parts of the country. Neither really has the Philippines or Thailand, or only to a limited extent. Now, these are all important issues. My own view is actually what happened in Taiwan and Korea was very much the result of those countries being, as it were, frontline states in the Cold War. They got quite a lot of assistance, particularly from the Americans, but they used that assistance well. Plenty of examples in other parts of the world, particularly parts of Central and South America, where you know, American aid, or indeed aid from other countries, including the former Soviet Union, this aid was largely wasted or simply used for corrupt purposes. Why didn't this happen in Taiwan and Korea? Now, I think most people who've looked at the period in the late 1960s, period roughly from 1966 through to the early 70s, when the technocrats were very successful at reducing inflation in Indonesia, stabilizing the exchange rate, foreign aid played an important role. And probably without foreign aid, the processes of reform would have been more difficult. But the aid was well used. Now, subsequently, when Indonesia got a lot of revenues from the oil boom in the 1970s, arguably the money wasn't as well used. And that, of course, raises a whole set of questions about why so many governments in various parts of the world seem to waste the revenues they get from natural resources. This is a great puzzle that's exercised the minds of a number of economists, political scientists, and so on, in countries as diverse as Nigeria and Iran, Venezuela. You can tick them all off. These are countries that have had oil booms or indeed natural resource booms. And frankly, difficult though it is for many people to understand, they've often ended up poorer at the end of these booms than they were at the beginning. Now, you can criticize Indonesia's use of natural resource revenues, but I think at least they avoided the worst trap, what's often referred to as the resource curse. And here I think one does have to pay tribute to the quality of the technocratic advice, but at the same time you had under Suharto, a government that was at least prepared to listen to this advice. And in some cases, particularly when it came, for example, to devaluations, to implement policies that were politically really very difficult. You know, I can vividly remember the 86 devaluation because I was in Jakarta at the time. It caused a lot of trouble, not least in the business community. But Suharto and his key ministers were able to, as it were, ride out the storm. And there's no question that devaluation and the other policies that were adopted led to a period of export diversification, increase in manufactured exports that lasted right up until the crisis of 97, 98. So these are all very important questions, and I think we need to do really a lot more research. They're controversial issues. People have very different opinions. But as I'm sure you know, probably from the vantage point of Timor-Leste, but they are extremely important. As I said, I'm deeply disappointed at what's happened in Myanmar over the last few months. I thought it really did look as if Myanmar was on a trajectory taking that country not just to better economic policies, but to more inclusive political, social policies as well. And that all seems to have stalled. One hopes that this is just the blip. But Myanmar seems to have been an exceptionally unfortunate country over the last 70 years in terms of its political leadership.
Thank you very much, Professor Booth, for the answer. I know that the discussion might be goes on and on because of a very interesting insight from you. However, time flies and we have to end the session here. Ibu Rebecca, is it okay if we stop here, or we still have time to another question, another participants to have question?
If there is somebody who already has a question, is waiting to ask the question, I think that is fine, but maybe if we could limit to a maximum of 5 minutes.
All right. Okay. Are there still any questions for Professor Booth in the last 5 minutes? Okay. Seems everyone would like to have a relaxing afternoon. So Professor Booth, the extra 5 minutes, I think I would like to ask your final conclusion regarding the webinar this afternoon. Your concluding statement for every one of us as the participants. Time is yours, Professor Booth.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the questions. I mean, I think I can only repeat what I said earlier. I think processes of institutional change are ongoing. The whole issue of which institutions support rapid economic growth and which are, in a sense, dysfunctional or inhibiting I think this does inevitably vary both across countries and over time. I think it's always useful to look at the success stories, and we know there's been some remarkable success stories in Asia. I mean, I mentioned Korea and Taiwan, but some of the ASEAN countries themselves have had periods of sustained economic growth. And these seem to be periods where economic policy making on the whole has been fairly effective, technocratic, at least in the sense there hasn't been overt meddling from particular lobby groups, or whether, and this is another issue that's much debated, whether the transition to a more open democratic system in Indonesia has actually had a negative influence on the quality of economic decision making. I think this is fascinating.
Ako yung may right now sa webinar yan. Timor Plaza.
Sorry?
I'm still webinar.
Mr. Joe, still on? Your microphone is still on? Okay. You may continue, Prof. Bruce, if there's still a statement to finish.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Oh, okay, right. No, I mean, I was just saying that processes of institutional reform are ongoing, and there are still a number of puzzles. As I said, in the case of Southeast Asia, although one can argue there hasn't been the sort of dazzling success stories that we've seen in Taiwan, or indeed Korea, or South Korea, or the Republic of Korea, there has been real progress. I'm particularly impressed by what's happened in Vietnam over the last 25 years, where a fairly autocratic government has been very successful in pushing rapid economic growth, and also, as far as we can judge from the available data, growth that's been reasonably egalitarian. In fact, some people would argue that Vietnam, since at least the early 1990s, has pursued an economic strategy not unlike that which occurred rather earlier in Taiwan. In other words, you had agricultural reform, land reform, and also following on from that, a significant macroeconomic liberalization, which seems to have produced both rapid industrial manufacturing sector growth, but also rapid growth in the agricultural sector. I mentioned earlier Taiwan's rather dramatic Vietnam's rather dramatic re-emergence as a rice exporter. And on top of that, of course, now an important exporter of other crops as well, coffee and various nuts and specialized agricultural products. Now, all this has obviously led to an improvement in living standards. Whether it will trigger demands for more political liberalization, very difficult to say. And as I say, I think in the Indonesian context, one of the key issues really is the extent to which a more open, if you like, quote, democratic, unquote, political system can coexist with what the kind of economic reforms which Mr. Malkan mentioned that everyone agrees are desperately needed in infrastructure, in education, in health policy, transport, and so on. Whether these can be brought about in the context of considerable political decentralization, for example. This was something Indonesia decided to adopt, rightly or wrongly, in the immediate post-Suharto era. And it's clearly caused problems in terms of the power of the central government to influence policies in what are now well over 500 Kabupaten and Kota. Now, all these are problems that Indonesia is going to have to continue to grapple with. There aren't easy solutions. And if there were easy solutions, I suppose the whole world would already be developed. One just has to continue to try and make progress in what, certainly for Indonesia, I think will continue to be quite difficult national and indeed a quite difficult national and international environment. Indonesia's got to face difficult problems when it comes to cutting carbon emissions. And I think it will face pressure, not least from the developed countries, to perhaps do more. As far as I know, Indonesia is still building coal-fired power stations. And many people now point to the problem of energy poverty in Indonesia. Many households still don't have access even to stable electricity supply, let alone relative luxuries like the internet. All these problems are going to have to be tackled. They will involve more government expenditure on the one hand, but more participation, I think, from the private sector as well.
Okay. Thank you very much for your concluding comment, Professor Booth. So to conclude, the institutional change is needed to develop export-oriented agriculture. The data from World Governance Indicator shows that Indonesia's ranking on various governance indicators actually has generally been rising this century. But as mentioned by Professor Booth, ongoing reform agenda in many areas, bureaucracy, legal system, central-local government relation, fostering greater trust in government, independent checks on government still needs to be done in finding solution to improve the governance of related institutions, especially if we also consider the increasing world population, current disruption on COVID pandemic, global climate change, industrial revolution, and other important issues. And also important to have the technocrats to streamline and implement solutions, which in turn maybe serve as an example for other Asian countries. We will give big applause for Professor
Apriani.
Yeah.
Is it okay? Just 1 minute. I would like to. I have one request. Very sorry. In the last page of the the second page of the conclusion of Professor Booth's presentation is about the bottom-up approach. In a sense, we tried here with Henry. I used to be at the World Bank also. Maybe, you know, Indonesia has two layers of government, central and local. And both in this level, there is this BUMN, state-owned company, both in central and also in local government, BUMD. If you have any study, any local government that are successful in developing the local economy through their BUMD, local state-owned government. I'm very interested if you have that material. You have my email address when I register. Can you kindly please send the study if you find one to me? Thank you so much.
Okay. So this is a request from Mr. Ahmad Malkan, Professor Booth, if you happen to have any research conducted regarding the state or the rural state-owned enterprise, or sorry, BUMDes ya Pak Ahmad ya.
BUMD, how the local government improve their
economy,
local economy through their state-owned, local state-owned company. We call it here BUMD.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know offhand of any work. I mean, there has been a lot of work done on decentralization. Some of it by political scientists. There's a recent book by Edward Aspinall at the ANU in Canberra and Ward Baronscott. He's at the University of Amsterdam, I think, one of the Dutch universities anyway. And that looks at the whole issue of decentralization from a political science perspective. It tends to be on the whole quite critical, although again, it does point to, and as I said, over 500 Kabupaten and Kota now. So obviously there's tremendous variation in outcomes. I think some political scientists tend to perhaps be overly critical in that they focus on, as it were, the bad examples rather than the good examples. But having said that, I think again, we need a lot more work. I'm sure there are examples where these BUMD are working quite well. There are probably other examples where they're not working at all, or only really as a vehicle for enriching local officials. So I suppose the more we can get good regional and local case studies, better really. We do need, I think, a lot more careful work at the regional level, because there is now quite clearly tremendous variation. And it was hoped, I think some of the expectations of the decentralization program were perhaps rather naive. Perhaps they expected more to happen at the local level, or more beneficial things to happen at the local level, in fact, was possible. And again, one of the real problems, quite clearly, is that local governments, Kabupaten and Kota, have had responsibilities pushed down to them, but not really given adequate funding. And I think that's true in health and education, and probably to some extent infrastructure as well. My understanding is that Kabupaten and Kota now have primary responsibility for certainly basic education and also for basic healthcare. And yet quite clearly, many of them simply do not have the facilities, and they don't have the budget to improve whatever facilities they already have. And this is a big problem. There isn't an easy solution.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Booth, for the last comment based on Mr. Malkan's question. Yeah, it is comprehensive and complex situation that are currently faced by Indonesian government. That is why Technocrats have to streamline and implement the solution. Also, the bottom-up approach, as you mentioned, is one of the approach that can be considered by the Technocrat. Once again, thank you very much for attending this webinar. Until we meet again in the upcoming webinars, on behalf of the Satyawacana Christian University and the committee members, would like to ask an apology if there are shortcomings in this webinar. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much
for all the knowledge sharing. It's an insightful knowledge, and we hope to see you again next time for more or deeper discussion regarding institutional change beyond agriculture sector. Stay safe and stay healthy for everyone.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Terima kasih banyak.
Terima kasih, Professor Booth. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Until we meet again next time.
Sengaja dari Inggris.
Okay. Professor, nice to see you. It's an enjoyable afternoon for me. I've never been expected to be the moderator of a distinguished economist. Yeah, I just saw your name in the cover of the book Ibu Konta asked us to read several years ago, but now I can see your face. I can listen directly to your presentation. It's an honor. Thank you very much for the webinar.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. And as I say, Henry does have the paper if anybody would like to have a look at the paper. And of course, there's a lot more reading. There's really a very large literature on these topics. And it's an interesting literature, if not always a terribly convincing one.
Oh, that is a good news. So we will contact Pak Henry and share your your paper to the participants later on.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Okay, enjoy the winter there. We are enjoying rainy season here.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye. I leave now by Professor Booth.